challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli, and it is time for, yes, the Thursday night live stream. Welcome, everybody who has joined us. And somebody's already asking, how's the weather in Budapest? You took the words out of my mouth. It is cold, it's wet, rainy, miserable, sunless, lightless, and the notion that somehow spring is around the corner is just laughable. But anyway, so with that out of the way, thank you everybody who has joined me. Really appreciate it. And obviously, there's been a number of um, events today, and we can address them one after another. So, obviously, the big event that broke early this morning was the arrest of what they call Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, but of course, I will call him by I think his proper name, which was Prince Andrew. So I don't hold anything particularly for Prince Andrew. I never cared for him very much. I do think, however, that he has been treated very, very unfairly. Um, there is no evidence that has emerged that he did anything wrong. Um, so the sum and substance of why he's now been excoriated, humiliated, kicked out of his home, stripped of his titles. That's got something. I mean, he's a prince. He's the son of the queen. The queen who sat on the throne for 70 years. So he's her son, and he's been now humiliated. Everything's been taken away from him. Somebody who served his country, served in the military of his country, and all because of this association with Jeffrey Epstein. But that isn't really enough. I mean, this is known as guilt by association. It doesn't mean he had done anything wrong. So the gravamen of the complaints against him, most of what the complaints against him which have been dragging on now for years, comes from this woman, Virginia Roberts Giuffre, who wrote this ridiculous memoir, whatever it was called, The Billionaires Playboy Club, or whatever stupid title it had. But she made things up. She was a complete fabulist. She just made everything up. So much of a fabulist was she, so much of a fiction writer was she, that her own lawyers said of her memoir, The Billionaires Playboy Club, or whatever, forget if that was the title, that it's a work of fiction. Her own lawyer said it's a work of fiction. Now, that's that part of it. That somehow that was she, and then she made up all the stuff about she was being passed around among all these rich and well-connected people and so on. Now, Virginia Giuffre, has had to withdraw a number of her charges against these very rich, famous people the moment that she was under any kind of challenge. And of course, that will notoriously happen with Alan Dershowitz, because she made very specific charges against Alan Dershowitz. And why did she choose Dershowitz? Well, Dershowitz was Epstein's lawyer. He had represented Epstein in the case down in Palm Beach, which was back in 2006 through to 2008. She, Virginia Giuffre, only came on the scene some years later, and making up all these stories about her association with Epstein. She had nothing to do with any of that Palm Beach stuff. But because Dershowitz was quite a well-known figure, and he was Epstein's lawyer, so she made the story up that she had multiple sexual encounters with Dershowitz, and Dershowitz, of course, threatened her with a lawsuit. and she had to beat a hasty retreat and said, "Well, maybe I got this wrong." Well, that's quite a mistake. I mean, if you're going to depend on her for your testimony against just about every rich, powerful, influential, well-known, whatever figure, and she has to continually um, withdraw her accusations, then you basically peddling nonsense, and that's what this has been. This has been just essentially peddling nonsense, um, because the, 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 the even let's say the case against Andrew. Let's say it's true. No, Andrew has denied. Andrew denied that he had had any kind of sexual relations with Virginia Giuffre. But let's say, okay, he's lying. Let's say he indeed did have sex with her. Well, she was over the age of consent in the UK when this happened. She was 17. And the age of consent in the UK is 16. So he had done nothing illegal. Now, they haven't charged him with sex trafficking and all the rest of it, which is what everybody is obsessed about with Jeffrey Epstein. So instead, they've talked about how he's misused his public office. Well, he really didn't have much of a public office. He was a kind of a trade negotiator. In other words, he's somebody who the British government used in order to secure trade agreements, contracts. It's nice. He's somebody who opens the door. He's royalty. Many people around the world are very impressed by royalty, and so how do you get people to sign on the dotted line? Well, you bring on the brother at the time, the brother of the Prince of Wales. That's what he did. He had no official position. I mean, it was just a way of greasing palms and facilitating um, trade agreements for the United Kingdom. So I don't know what kind of information, if that's true, as alleged, that he supposedly passed on to Jeffrey Epstein. It certainly wasn't classified information. So he didn't go around revealing things that were state secrets. Probably he just passed on information about which I think was already in the you can read about in the media, possible business deal, trade agreements that Great Britain was involved in. That's all. There's nothing else that he could reveal to Epstein, if indeed he did reveal anything to Epstein. Nothing that wasn't already publicly available, and certainly wasn't any kind of classified information. I have never heard of anyone being prosecuted that they were passing on information that they had heard from government ministers, or they knew something about um, potential agreements or whatever. This wasn't insider trading. I mean, he just simply um, passing on information. That's what people do. That's known as gossip. It's the way the world moves. You pass on information. Oh, the minister told me this. I heard this and this and so on. So that's it. Now, the reason they're going after him for this is that they failed to go after him on the sexual thing. And why have they failed to go after him on the sexual business? Well, because they don't have any evidence. They don't have a case. They don't have a case on the issue of Virginia Giuffre. If indeed there were sexual relations between them, it was consensual. She was above the age of consent, so he committed no crime, if indeed that happened. So since you can't go after him on this, on which the ostensible source of this now international hysteria about Jeffrey Epstein, you can't go after him on that because there's no evidence that he had had sex with any underage girls. So we'll go after him for something else. So that's it. Oh, we can't do that. Well, let's go after him on this. So it's similar to what happened with Peter Mandelson, because they went after Mandelson on supposedly passing on some information, again not classified information that he was privy to, not exactly highly secret. I mean, these kinds of agreements are discussed very extensively in the media. Whenever some Euro rescue package, everyone knew about this. They couldn't very well go after Mandelson on the sexual business because, of course, Mandelson is openly gay, and therefore he wouldn't exactly be eligible for Epstein's supposed sex trafficking operation. So they have to go after him for something else. But the reason they do this is in order to keep um, the the story going, that somehow horrific things happen. You just keep Jeffrey Epstein, Jeffrey Epstein. So every story, every news show begins with a Jeffrey Epstein story. The man's now been dead for 26. So now, I guess 6.5 years now he's been dead. And it's just this obsession continues, and it's obsession based entirely on something that's fictional. It's a word. It's fictional that all that these things happen. This sex trafficking, extortion, blackmail, child. Well, in this case, with the child, we don't even know. Is it the child rape, child murder, child cannibalism? These lurid, nonsensical claims based on nothing. But it keeps eyeballs firmly on sites. Keep people tuning in to news shows, and then somebody else gets to be destroyed. Yeah, sorry. Reputations get destroyed, but no one really cares about that. And so, and they said, okay, well, we'll go on to the next thing. So no one is even saying, well, we're going on about Andrew and this his supposed misuse of public office, whatever the hell that is. I mean, I didn't know that was a crime. I mean, I just always assume public office is something that people misuse. I mean, that's the whole point of holding a public office, is you're going to misuse it. So I don't know where the crime is, and because as I say, no evidence that he was passing on any classified information. But in misuse of public office, and the only reason we're talking about this is that all the lurid stories about Epstein and his sex blackmail, child cannibalism, whatnot schemes, for none of which has any evidence been presented. So that was the story, and then of course King Charles issued this statement, and I want to just read this statement just to get a feel for the man. So here it is. It says, "A statement from His Majesty the King. I have learned with the deepest concern the news about Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and suspicion of misconduct in public office." I mean, has anyone actually been in public office and not engaged in misconduct? I don't know. That would be an interesting one. What now follows is the full, fair, and proper process by which this issue is investigated in the appropriate manner and by the appropriate authorities. In this, as I've said before, they have our full and wholehearted support and cooperation. So you accept that it's going to be full, fair, and proper? And the issue is investing in the appropriate manner, appropriate authorities, full, wholehearted support and cooperation. And then he goes on. Let me state clearly, the law must take its course. As this process continues, it would not be right for me to comment further on this matter. Meanwhile, my family and I will continue in our duty and service to you all. All right. So that's the king. Now, the interesting thing is, he's talking here about his own brother. And note what's absent in this statement. Any kind of expression of any familial loyalty, familial fondness, familial concern for his younger brother, who's now in some jeopardy. They could bring criminal charges against him. That's going to be a major source of headache and stress for him for maybe 2-3 years. He's not a young man. His brother, he's 66 today. And notice that they also did this arrest on his birthday. That was no accident. That was not happenstance. It's part of the sadistic process of trying to humiliate him. So they have to pick his birthday to arrest him. So his brother has already humiliated him, with taking away his titles, taking away his home, and essentially it's kind of open season on him. The media are naturally all trashing him. No one says anything positive about him. No one even so much as says, well, you're gonna, innocent until proven guilty. I mean, it's just hold off on judgment. No. Just the victims have been vindicated. The victims have been, made whole or whatever. Now, nothing is more repulsive than the family of Virginia Giuffre, who are being paraded around in the media, who have all become very, very rich as a result of all these settlements. So all these settlements have been made on this woman, this fabulous, just made the whole stuff up. But all these shameless corporations who just throw money around have lavished large sums on Virginia Giuffre, which means that her family have become rather rich, and they have the nerve to show up on all these TV shows and talk about, it's about time for accountability. We're going to have some accountability, because we have time for justice. What what accountability? How about you become accountable for how you become fabulously wealthy on the basis of nothing, on the basis of fiction, and on the basis of your being part of this, of being related to Virginia Giuffre. And this, again, the media keep repeating this cliche that when is there going to be any accountability for the victims? I mean, these are people who have all become amazingly rich for no reason at all. Almost all of them came into Epstein's orbit when they were above the age of consent. I mean, the whole idea that you're a victim even though you came into Epstein's orbit when you were in your 20s, and you were actually lavished very generously by Epstein with all sorts of gifts, introductions. He paid for your courses in college, and now you're the victim. Victim of what? I mean, you had a whale of a time in the world of Epstein, and now the media just playing along with this, that somehow they are victims. So that was all quite repulsive. And of course, the royal family are very good at really treating their own in really really shittily, because you know I I, I I never really had particularly strong views about King Edward VIII, um, but I, forcing him to abdicate, even though he had done nothing wrong, forcing him to abdicate because he married this woman who had been divorced. Imagine that he was divorced. We're living in the time when everyone's sort of people are now advocating for euthanasia. I remember this is only 90 years ago, but now Parliament passes legislation essentially mandating killing of granny, and or abortion available up until 24 weeks of pregnancy, um, and everything else, with with the transgender, there's the open borders, bringing in millions and millions and millions of migrants and everything else. But this horrific event, again, this was only 90 years ago, that he, Edward VIII, wanted to marry a woman who had been divorced. That's it. That's all. That's all. And that was supposedly so scandalous that he had to give up the throne, which he did. Um, and then once he did that, he was essentially banished from the country. So that first of all, they got him to abdicate, and then they banished him and humiliated him. He was, and never darkened his doorstep again. Went off, go live somewhere else. Um, it was quite a disgusting thing. Now, um, Charles seems ready to do something very similar to Andrew. And if Andrew is sent to prison, I don't know whether he will. I have my doubts that they're ever going to be able to make much of a case against him. But they can't humiliate him for several years by holding these criminal charges over his head. Um, but he's not going to get too much sympathy from his older brother. So then anyway, that was one item, and I guess since this hysteria is likely to continue, Peter Mandelson will also likely face some kind of criminal charges. It's a little much why Andrew should be arrested, but not Mandelson. But anyway, but he now Andrew has been released, but he's still under investigation. So that means that this can just go on for a long time. But anyway, so that was one item on the news. Another item was the inaugural meeting of the Board of Peace. Now, there was something very strange about this inaugural meeting. So, as you know, I have actually been quite positive about the Board of Peace. I thought that this was quite an innovative solution, and it was basically a way of getting other countries involved in Gaza. So there was a way to get away from the format of Oslo and these kinds of negotiations, which involve the Palestinians, Israel, and the United States. And so the United States and Israel could just simply get together and bully the Palestinians. And that obviously wasn't going to go anywhere. But by involving other countries, that I thought, well, maybe this could work because now a lot of other countries are now involved in this, and money has been raised. I mean, Trump said he's putting forward $10 billion for the Board of Peace, and Trump said that 7 billion has been pledged by other countries, and then of course you've got the members of the Board of Peace who if they want permanent membership, they offer $1 billion, and that keeps them on the board forever. And then of course under the Board of Peace you have the Palestinian government of technocrats, and then there's the middleman who's going to liaise between the board and the Palestinian government. So my feeling was that, well, okay, this is a way of you know trying to address this intractable problem. And so basically, the other countries are going to be involved. If Israel is going to relaunch its war in Gaza, it will actually be doing it in defiance of Trump, in defiance of the United States, and in defiance of all the different countries that are now involved in Gaza. And all of whom now have a stake in the success. So that's why I said, well, okay, it sounds a little strange, the Board of Peace, but it may just do the job. It may just hamper Israel's plans to continue to starve and beat Gaza into humiliation. So that was that. So I got a positive. However, Trump used this occasion once again to threaten Iran. Now that's very, very strange because the whole point of a Board of Peace is peace, and the whole point of proclaiming yourself to be a peacemaker is that you make peace, and so for him to use the occasion of the inauguration of the Board of Peace to threaten Iran was somewhat incongruous, and particularly as he repeatedly said during his speech today, he said, well, we now have peace in the Middle East. We have peace in the Middle East. Well, how can you have peace in the Middle East if you're about to unleash, according to the media reports, you're about to unleash the biggest attack, I don't know, on the Middle East, big, at least as big as the attack that was launched by George W. Bush on in the operation in 2003, and then of course even his father, and Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. So those, if you're about to do that, then it becomes very strange if you're talking about peace. So it was a bizarre event, and you had to wonder what these guests were thinking. Now they may just think, well, there's nothing really much we can do. This is probably the best that we can get in order to bring this war in Gaza to an end. But they can't really be very happy that at any moment Trump could unleash a hailstorm of bombs and missiles and whatnot against Iran. So here is at least the latest that we have. I mean, because Trump has put a lot of firepower in place in the region. It's got 2 aircraft carriers and an enormous number of aircraft and missiles and everything. They're all in place there, which of course makes it very difficult when you do that. Very difficult to step off. And anyway, here's the story in The Guardian. talking about Trump's speech at this inauguration of the Board of Peace, Trump spoke of the airstrikes the US carried out in June on Iran's nuclear facilities, claiming that the country's nuclear potential had been decimated. We may have to take it a step further, or we may not, he said, hinting that he could take a decision very soon. You'll be finding out over the next probably 10 days. So just because he says 10 days doesn't mean that that he's going to wait 10 days. He may go at any time. Trump's comments follow months of massive U.S. military buildup of aircraft carriers, warships, and jets in the region, largest since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. That has fueled fears that a full-scale attack on Iran could be imminent. And then Iranian and U.S. negotiators met on Tuesday, and so on. And then, and it said, but White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said on Wednesday that the two sides remained apart on some issues. Trump said good talks are being had, and the senior U.S. official told Reuters that Iran would make a written proposal on how to address U.S. concerns. Trump, meanwhile, called on Tehran to join the U.S. on the path to peace. They can't have a nuclear weapon. It's very simple. You can't have peace in the Middle East if they have a nuclear weapon. Now, this is very odd because what Trump is doing here is trying to spell out a reason for why he's about to launch an attack on Iran. And it's very peculiar because this has to be the most overtly unprovoked attacks ever. I mean, the United States has no grievances whatsoever that it can actually level at Iran. Iran hasn't done anything to the United States. Iran hasn't violated any agreements, hasn't violated any treaties, hasn't engaged in any aggression against anyone. And here we are, we're talking about some attack that could happen at any time. So, some kind of explanation might be in order. And so it says, oh, they can't have a nuclear weapon. Well, this is very strange because, of course, he had said last June that he had destroyed Iran's nuclear facilities. He said, well, we did it. We absolutely destroyed it. Completely obliterated. Kept saying it. And over and over and over again, you talk about the B-2 is a fantastic, pinpoint accuracy, destroyed everything. Well, that makes it very odd as to, well, why are you attacking again? If you destroyed it, what's the objective? So it says, well, you can't have a nuclear weapon. Well, how can Iran have a nuclear weapon if you've obliterated their nuclear facilities? They're not able any longer to enrich uranium. They might in a few years' time, but at the moment they can't enrich uranium. You've destroyed their nuclear facilities. So why is he doing this? And I think that's where the connection with the Board of Peace is. I think he's doing this as part of a quid pro quo with Israel. As long as Israel has joined the Board of Peace. So as long as Israel accepts that basically its war in Gaza is at an end, that it can't do anything more in Gaza, and therefore Israel joins the Board of Peace, and then therefore Israel accepts the government of the Palestinian technocrats and so on. In other words, Israel will not be able to annex the Gaza. Israel will not be able to ethnically cleanse Gaza. That in other words, that project has now been put, at the very least, put in abeyance. So therefore, there has to be a quid pro quo. Israel has to get something in return. We ended our war in Gaza at your behest. We joined your Board of Peace. We've accepted that Gaza will be Palestinian. But then we want something in return. Well, what do you want in return? What do we want in return is that you decimate Iran. Now, Trump can't really say that, and therefore he puts this phony baloney story out about the nuclear weapons, which, as I say, not only is just simply not feasible that Iran could develop nuclear weapons, but Iran, of course, has said on many occasions that it has no intention of developing nuclear weapons, and Iran has made no moves to leave the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So, and that's very important to keep in mind, that Iran really hasn't done anything that's in violation of any international obligations. The Non-Proliferation Treaty does not prohibit any country from enriching uranium. So Iran can enrich uranium. Iran can't build nuclear weapons, but Iran can enrich uranium. So the peaceful use of nuclear energy is not prohibited by the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And all the talk, I mean, J.D. Vance went in for this, saying, "Oh well, yes, you can have peaceful nuclear energy, but doesn't mean that you can enrich uranium. Look at all these countries who actually enjoy nuclear energy, but they don't actually enrich uranium." Yeah, that's true. I mean, there are plenty of countries who do enjoy nuclear energy, but they don't engage in uranium enrichment. But it doesn't matter. You are still entitled, under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to enrich uranium. So Trump is essentially putting out the story, no nuclear weapons, but in reality, this is all to be done in coordination with Israel. This is Israel's policy. And that's why he has real difficulties explaining how any of this favors the United States. So anyway, that was the story in the Guardian, and then we have the Times of Israel, which again says Trump hints he'll make a decision on potential Iran strike in 10 days. And it says, maybe we're going to make a deal. And then you're going to be finding out over the next probably 10 days, Trump says. Trump reiterates that Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. You can't have peace in the Middle East if they have a nuclear weapon. But this is what I mean. It's so bizarre for him to be saying that when he repeatedly says, we, destroyed their nuclear capabilities. Now he claims that they were 1 month away from having a nuclear weapon. I mean, flying totally in the face of his own intelligence agencies, who said that they're nowhere near having a nuclear weapon, and his own intelligence agencies told him that they don't have any intent to build a nuclear weapon. Now is the time for Iran to join us on a path that will complete what we're doing. If they join us, that'll be great. If they don't join us, that'll be great too, but it'll be a very different path. They cannot continue to threaten the stability of the entire region. So this is just simply the line from Israel about how they're threatening the stability of the entire region. What's the evidence that they're threatening the stability of the entire region? What are they? What stability is under threat? Now, the only it was the invasion of Iraq that, of course, undermined the stability. I mean, the idea of the United States is worried about stability when everything it does in the region undermines stability. I mean, it's hilarious. Stability. What we really want is stability. So unleashing a massive attack on Iran enhances stability. How does attacking Iran enhance stability? You could well absolutely throw the whole country into turmoil, into collapse, into civil war. That could happen, and that enhances stability. That makes it more stable. No, I mean it'll be just total breakdown of a huge country, 92 million. Of course, massive flow of migrants is to be expected. But then war, I mean, and a war that's going to go on for years. I mean, there would then be a struggle for power for years, as there has been in Libya. I mean, it's hard to believe. It's now the bombing of Libya was 2011, so now that's 15 years ago, and there's no government in Libya. There's still a civil war in Libya, and that's a small country. Iran's much bigger. So one has to assume, Trump and the people around Trump know perfect well this isn't going to enhance stability. This is going to facilitate instability. Well, whom does this favor? Well, of course, it favors Israel. So if it's unstable, well, then, Israel can get to do whatever it wants because, well, this instability is threatening us. Anyway, they must make a deal. If that doesn't happen, bad things will happen, he adds. And then we have the New York Times. U.S. military moves into place for possible strikes in Iran. And then it says President Trump has given no indication that he has made a decision. The rapid buildup of U.S. forces in the Middle East has progressed to the point that President Trump has the option to take military action against Iran as soon as this weekend. And then it says Mr. Trump has repeatedly threatened that Iran must meet his terms or face severe consequences. But another attack, 8 months after a 12-day war in which Israel and the United States assaulted military and nuclear sites across Iran, would potentially carry substantial risks, including that Iran would respond with a ferocious barrage of missiles strikes on Israel and on U.S. forces in the region. And then, of course, the Times says, rightly, for a president who ran for office promising to keep the United States out of wars, Mr. Trump is now considering what would be at least the seventh American military attack in another country in the past year, and he's second on Iran. Last June, after striking three Iranian nuclear sites, Mr. Trump declared that Iran's nuclear program had been obliterated. But now he's considering sending U.S. military back to continue the job. So, yeah, it's somewhat puzzling. But unlike the U.S. Israel assault last June, Mr. Trump's objectives now are less clear. In Israel, two defense officials said that significant preparations were underway for the possibility of a joint strike with the United States, even though no decision has been made about whether to carry out such an attack. They said the planning envisions delivering a severe blow over a number of days with the goal of forcing Iran into concessions at the negotiating table that it has so far been unwilling to make. Well, this is a similar the parallelism of Russia. Oh, we'll do this, this, and this, and this, and then Russia will come to the negotiating table and make concessions. Why would it? Why would Iran make any of these concessions? I mean, what's the logic there? Because they know Iran knows that any concessions it makes will simply be pocketed, and then the bombing will be renewed in 3-4 months' time. Once the missiles have been replaced and the interceptors have been replaced, then of course the attack will be renewed. Why would Iran have any incentive to make any concession? So but that's presented here. Oh, well, that was what the Israelis said. Now, it's quite exceptional, first of all, to launch an attack that is wholly unprovoked. I mean, it's been done, but a wholly unprovoked is unusual, because normally at least there is some provocation, some set of demands that have some justification for it. So let's think of what are the U.S. demands. Okay, you stop enrichment. Well, that's like you could make that demand. Iran isn't doing anything illegal in enriching, and Iran has been willing, more than willing, it certainly had been under the JCPOA, of keeping the level of enrichment so low, which was I think about 3% or whatever it was under the JCPOA. It was so low that it's ridiculous to even talk about that this can become nuclear weapons capable. Nuclear weapons capable is 90%. So 3% is not 90%. So that was nonsensical. And then the issue of the remove the ballistic missiles. Well, the ballistic missiles pose no threat, obviously, to the United States. They might pose a threat to Israel, but only if Israel provokes Iran. I mean, if Israel wants to attack Iran, then Iran will retaliate with its ballistic missiles. But in principle, Iran has no intention of using its ballistic missiles other than in defense. So the idea that you're going to pulverize Iran because it retains a capability to defend itself is that's about as aggressive an act as you can get. So when I thought, well, the negotiating table, what exactly is Iran being asked to negotiate? Now you could say, okay, no enrichment. Well, all right, no enrichment, fine. But Iran isn't enriching. There's no enrichment going on. So you're saying, well, Iran in principle will say no enrichment. Okay, I mean, which you're going to make a commitment for something that's going to be years and years down the road. So that makes little sense. So and then the ballistic missiles. Well, no Iranian government, secular, clerical, whatever, will give up its missiles. So essentially, this is a part of an Israel project. Israel obviously has an interest in weakening and debilitating, and I think destroying Iran. So I think Israel does have an interest in provoking a complete collapse within Iran. Because once it collapses, then it's going to take decades for the country to recover, some kind of a government to be formed that will be able to consolidate itself, and it's going to take a long time. So that is obviously the plan, and I think it's a quid pro quo for Israel's acceptance of the board of peace, because otherwise, what Trump is doing makes very little sense. Now, the question, I guess, is what happens then if Trump does indeed launch this attack? And I think the attack will come, because I don't think Iran will make any concessions, and for the reason that I've said, that any concessions Iran makes would simply be pocketed and say, well, okay, we've got that. Now let's threaten them some more and extract more concessions from them. So that's why I don't think they're in the mood to concede anything. So therefore, the Trump attacks. Now, how much damage the United States would be able to inflict in any sustained bombing campaign, I don't know. I mean, presumably they'll be able to inflict quite a lot of damage. How much damage can Iran inflict on the United States military forces in the region? I don't know. That's hard. I mean, probably they will. How much damage can they inflict on Israel? Probably a considerable amount. But the missiles they have are limited. I mean, at some point they're going to run out of missiles. I mean, it's not a kind of an infinite pool of missiles that they can just keep launching and launching and launching them. I mean, at some point they're not going to have any more. So each time they launch missiles, I mean, maybe one gets through, but 4 or 5 are destroyed. So it's questionable how much damage that they can inflict. Where the question might be interesting is the issue is, are there forces within Iran that can seize on um, this opportunity, use that as a historic opportunity to mount an insurrection against the government that could seize power? I don't know. It's that's a good question. I mean, you have to think that the government had been infiltrated by the United States and Israel, and it's possible that there would be a uh, some kind of a coup if the IRGC forces are severely weakened during an attack, so that somehow an insurrection might be possible. I have my doubt that this could work, but that may be part of the calculation. But anyway, just look a little bit more on this New York Times piece, and here we have some. Um, it says the U.S. buildup suggests an array of possible Iranian targets, including short and medium-range missiles, missile storage depots, nuclear sites, and other military targets, such as the headquarters of the IRGC. So I think that's what they would be thinking. Or if they can severely weaken the um, the forces of the government, that might open the way to a successful insurrection. Um, I think that would be very difficult. Um, but yeah, I mean, it'd be something a little bit like the Libyan model, because if you remember how they did the NATO attack on Libya in 2011, was that you had the attack on the military forces and the capabilities of the Libyan government, of Gaddafi's government, coinciding with the insurrection. So you had an insurrection against Gaddafi, while at the same time Gaddafi was under attack from NATO. So in fact, NATO was the air force of the insurrectionists. So it succeeded in Libya. It succeeded. They tried that in Serbia in 1999, when they had the Kosovo Liberation Army, was basically instructed to mount an insurrection and try to defeat um, uh, Serbia, the Serbian Yugoslav forces, while NATO was bombing those same Serb Yugoslav forces. The Serbs, however, um, managed to defeat the Kosovo Liberation Army, so that was gone. And once that was over, once the Kosovo Liberation Army had been defeated, then NATO really had no other option but to start planning to invade themselves, which they started to do. They started to make those plans in April, but in this case, I mean, an invasion of Iran is not feasible. So they would just be hoping for a successful insurrection against the Iranian government. I have my doubts that that could work. I think that would be unsuccessful. I would think that even in circumstances in which the government is under attack by the United States and Israel, even in those circumstances, the government forces would be able to defeat any insurrection within. Um, and anyway, let's look at the Times article again. And then one military official said the U.S. military could now defend its troops, allies, and assets from any Iranian retaliation for for American strikes on its nuclear and military targets, at least for a short campaign. But the official said the question remained as to whether the American military is ready to sustain a longer and wider war. The American buildup also includes dozens of additional F 35s, F 22, and F 16 fighter jets that have been flowing from the United States to Europe and onward to the Middle East in recent days. And then, okay, so the way they're presenting this. Um, I think it's going to happen because I don't see how there is anything that Iran can do that can stop this. Iran isn't going to make the kinds of essentially a total capitulation, which is what the U.S. is demanding from Iran. Give up enrichment completely, which at least that might be doable. They could maybe work something out along those lines, but that might still be work. But they're never going to give up their ballistic missiles. So that's just a non-starter. So I think it's going to happen, and then you have to wonder what plan the U.S. Has up its sleeve, because I can't really believe that just hitting, Iranian missiles and storage depots and air defense systems and whatever, or IRGC command centers, that can bring about regime change. So you then have to wonder: is there something else? Do they have something else up their sleeve, such as an insurrection or some sort of indigenous movements that they can sponsor that could be a serious problem for Tehran? All right, so that's that issue. Now, one other thing that I wanted to talk about is the let me just trying to let me okay okay all right. Just want well, the one other thing that I want to talk about is this. Right now, there's an interesting conflict that's been brewing between Hungary and Croatia. So, as you know, Hungary continues to receive. I mean, it receives gas from Russia via the Turk Stream gas pipeline. But Hungary also continues to receive oil from Russia via the Druzhba pipeline, which goes through Ukraine. Now, Ukraine has been making all sorts of noises over the years, demanding that Hungary stop receiving oil from Russia, and basically threatening the Druzhba pipeline. And there've been various times in which Ukraine has launched attacks on the Druzhba pipelines, and then suddenly the oil stopped flowing. And the EU had been demanding that Hungary stop receiving oil from Russia. Now, when the oil sanctions were first imposed on Russia back in 2022, there was a special exemption made for countries such as Hungary that received their oil by pipeline. So if you got your oil from Russia by sea, then basically the sanctions were, you cut yourself off. No more oil from Russia. But if you got your oil by pipeline, in other words, that you couldn't get your oil by sea, then because you were landlocked, then essentially you had an exemption for whatever number of years. So that applied to Hungary, that applied to Slovakia, that applied to the Czech Republic. even though there's been a lot of pressure that had been applied against Hungary and Slovakia that they continue to receive oil from Russia. And along comes Croatia, because Croatia, of course, does get oil by sea, not Russian oil, but it gets oil by sea. And Croatia has been saying, well, you don't need to receive any oil by pipeline from Russia. You can get your oil from us. We get our oil by sea, and we can pipe the oil to you from the Adriatic. And Hungary has said, no, that doesn't sound like a very good idea, because, of course, it's going to cost us a hell of a lot more. And this is going to be exorbitant energy prices. But Croatia has continued to apply pressure, because, of course, this is going to it's a good deal for Croatia. I mean, they'll essentially be responsible for providing oil to Hungary, and they're going to be making a lot of money. So now, with the sudden mysterious breakdown of the Druzhba pipeline, Hungary is in has a bit of a problem. And as has Slovakia, they can't get any oil, and so they've demanded first that Ukraine repair the Druzhba pipeline, and then the second thing that they demanded is that, well, okay, if Ukraine is unwilling to repair the Druzhba pipeline, then we should be able to receive our oil from Russia by sea, and that Croatia should cooperate with us in allowing us to receive oil from Russia, but by sea. And the Hungarians insist that was part of the exemption. When Hungary received its exemption in 2022, that was baked in. If there are any problems with the delivery of oil by pipeline, Hungary would still be able to, not just Hungary, but all of the landlocked countries would be able to receive Russian oil by sea, and then they would be piped into those landlocked countries. Croatia, however, is not playing ball. So this is leading to a considerable amount of tension. So let's just take a look at how this story has developed. And so this is this was the Facebook post issued by Hungarian Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó, who says, we previously fought together with Slovakia to ensure that Hungary and Slovakia can continue to buy cheap Russian crude oil via what they call the Friendship Oil Pipeline, which is the Druzhba pipeline. The exception to our sanctions also includes the fact that if pipeline transport becomes impossible, we can also obtain Russian crude oil via sea routes. This is the point. This exception to our sanctions also includes the fact that if pipeline transport becomes impossible, we can also obtain Russian crude via sea routes. However, the Ukrainians are still not restarting oil transport via the Druzhba oil pipeline for political reasons. So today, with the Slovak Ministry of the Economy, Denisa Shakova, we wrote to the Croatian Ministry of Economy, Ante Shushnya, asking Croatia to immediately allow the transport of Russian crude oil to Hungary and Slovakia via the Adriatic oil pipelines in accordance with the Brussels rules. And then the security of energy supply for a single country, including our country, cannot be an ideological issue, so we expect the Croatians, unlike Ukraine, not to risk the security of Hungary and Slovakia's crude oil supply for political reasons. All right, well, good luck with that. Anyway, then here's a story from Bloomberg, which points out that Croatia doesn't seem to be at all willing to cooperate with Hungary. So here's Bloomberg saying Croatia's Plenković, he's the prime minister, skeptical on Hungary's oil pipeline request. Croatian Prime Minister Andrej Plenković dampened expectations that Hungary could use a pipeline controlled by his country to help replace Russian oil supplies halted by a blockage in Ukraine. Plenković was speaking shortly after MOL, that's the main Hungary oil company, MOL said it had asked its government to release strategic oil reserves to keep its refineries operating. He said he would consider Hungary's request to import Russian crude via Croatian ports and pipelines. He added that Croatia will see how it can fulfill its neighborly role while respecting European Union and US bans on Russian crude. So this is an exemption that allows Hungary to buy Russian crude, but there is also a system of US sanctions that says something completely opposite, says Plenković. Now, of course, Plenković is lying because he knows perfectly well, as of course Gagglers do, because we've talked about this many times before, that Trump gave Hungary an exemption from the sanctions that it imposed on Lukoil and Rosneft. That was when Orban visited Trump in I think it was December, either November, December. That was it. That was the so he says here lying. Oh well, we can't violate the U.S. sanctions. They did the same thing. The Croats did the same thing when Vucic was under sanctions. Also, they imposed the sanctions on NIS Serbia, but that wasn't because of Lukoil and Rosneft. I mean, that was because they were demanding that Serbia force Russia to sell off its majority holding in NIS Serbia, which now Serbia has done. Hungary's MOL has purchased that majority shareholding. To access enough oil, MOL has started supplying its refineries with seaborne crude. However, these shipments are only expected to arrive at the port of Omišalj in Croatia in early March, according to the company, and it will then take 5 to 12 days for the oil to reach its refineries. JANAF, Croatia's state-owned pipeline operator, is already transporting non-Russian crude to MOL refineries in Hungary and Slovakia. In recent months, MOL repeatedly complained about JANAF's capacity and higher than usual costs. And that's really the problem, that this plan of, we're getting non-Russian crude from via Croatia, that Croatia is absolutely hitting us, and we're paying 4 times as much as we were for Russian crude. Anyway, Plenković said that the current situation shows that JANAF has been able to satisfy Hungarian import needs all along. No, it hasn't. It confirms what Croatia has been saying all along, that the Hungarian exemption to get crude from Russia is entirely unnecessary. Yeah, you're saying all this, but it's completely untrue, and Hungary doesn't accept it, and you have no right to make all sorts of demands on a sovereign state of Hungary as to where Hungary gets its energy from. Who cares what Croatia has been saying all along, that Hungarian exemption to get crude from Russia is entirely unnecessary? Well, Hungary doesn't think it's unnecessary. And then here is this this creature, Ante Shushnya, this energy minister. Croatia has acted responsibly and transparently on regional energy security, and we will do so again for our Hungarian Seato and Slovak friends, while fully respecting our Ukrainian allies and the daily suffering they endure. So, in other words, forget getting, forget our helping the Hungarians. When we were told the Adria pipeline had no capacity, it did and it does. Nobody said Adria pipeline had no capacity. What the Hungarians said that it's going to be bloody expensive and the Croatians are going to operate on a massive markup. When we were accused of war profiteering, our tariffs were and remain transparent and market based. When Croatia was labeled an unreliable transit country, we kept critical infrastructure stable and uninterrupted, independent of any political accusations. Croatia will not allow Central Europe's fuel supply to be endangered. We are ready to help solve the acute disruption within EU law and OFAC regulations. OFAC, that's the United States. So that bringing up the issue of the sanctions that the United States imposed on Lukoil and Rosneft. No one should be left without fuel. All right, so that was his. But and then it goes on here. But honestly, here's the lesson: the EU Commission, the Adria pipeline is ready, so there are no technical excuses for staying tied to Russian crude for any EU country. Yeah, there is. It's very expensive, and you know, doesn't matter what you think. That Hungary wants to receive Russian crude. No technical excuses left for staying tied to Russian crude for any EU country. A barrel bought from Russia may appear cheaper to some countries, but helps fund war and attacks on Ukrainian people. It's time to stop that war profiteering. Well, that's your that you can hold that view. You don't really have a right to inflict that view on Hungary. Infrastructure does not change overnight. Narratives sometimes do. What stupid. Anyway, Siarto then responded to this Croat. Let's be clear. Hungary is not asking Croatia for a favor regarding the Adria pipeline, but for compliance with binding EU rules in case pipeline transit becomes difficult or impossible. Ukraine is blocking oil deliveries on the Druzhba pipeline for political reasons. Yeah. In such case, EU law allows Hungary and Slovakia to purchase Russian oil by sea. Now the Adria pipeline can be used for what it was built for, a supplementary route when eastern deliveries are hindered, even if it cannot fully supply Hungary and Slovakia on its own. And but here there's an article here. This is from a Ukrainian publication that actually confirms what Hungary is saying. That yeah, that was the deal in 2022. See, you can look at the headline. EU allows temporary exception for Russian oil imports to Hungary via Croatia. The European Commission has confirmed that Russian oil may reach Hungary via Croatia as a temporary sanctions exemption in connection with damage to the Druzhba pipeline caused by Russia's strikes in Ukraine. And then these statements were voiced by European Commission spokespersons, whatever, and Anna Kaisit-Konin and Shivon Magari. And goes on. Yesterday, Hungary announced its desire to apply a temporary exemption to the import of Russian crude oil by sea via Croatia in the context of the disruption to flows along the Druzhba pipeline. Itkonian stressed that it is Russia that bears responsibility for the pipeline damage, and the EC's priority is the energy security of member states. At the same time, she assured that there's no immediate threat since Hungary and Slovakia have emergency oil stocks sufficient to cover about 90 days of demand. And then the other spokesperson says the EU sanctions regulation truly allows relief from the ban on the import of crude oil and oil products when the supply of crude oil via the pipeline from Russia to a member state without sea access is interrupted for reasons outside that member state's control. So essentially, This is from the European Commission itself. They support the position taken by Hungary. Now, whether that's actually going to materialize into anything, that's a different issue. But as a matter of law, they're saying, yeah, you're right. The exemption that that Hungary was granted in 2022 does indeed say that if there is an interruption to the oil deliveries via the pipeline, that can be supplemented by Russian oil by the sea, which is precisely what Croatia is denying. This exemption should be temporary until supply is restored or until the Council of the EU adopts a decision to impose an oil import ban. But Gary also noted that during the period of the exemption, the member state is obliged to report to the European Commission every 3 months on the volumes of crude oil they import by sea from Russia. All right, so before we go on, it's very important to get a sense of what's really going on here. Croatia and Ukraine have a timeline according to which they're operating. They know perfectly well there's going to be an election in Hungary in less than 2 months, April the 12th. They know that Orban is behind in the polls, and they see this as an opportunity that hasn't appeared in a long time in getting rid of Orban. So they are now all in the business of trying to generate as much unpopularity for Orban as possible. So basically, if energy prices spike in Hungary during the next 1.5 months, Orban's defeat is guaranteed. Well, we know, Zelensky has been openly threatened Orban. He did that in Davos. He did that in Munich, and of course you got this Croatia, who also see this as an opportunity to raise the cost for Hungary. And so that's why they're going to make sure to make life as difficult as possible for Orban in order to increase his unpopularity. So that's really what's behind the sudden. Oh well, we can't repair the Druzhba pipeline, and Croatia said, no, I'm afraid we can't deliver Russian crude as we are supposed to do. And so then that this goes on. Ante Shushnya, then he responds again to Siarto and says it's genuinely heartwarming to hear Hungary speak with such conviction about EU law, dripping with sarcasm. Note the sarcastic tone. Genuinely heartwarming to hear Hungary speak with such conviction about EU law, European values, and binding obligations. When those words are more than a talking point or a tweet, they are exactly what keep our region stable and secure. Decades ago, Hungarian strategic thinking supported a stronger Adriatic pipeline, so Central Europe would never be trapped by a single eastern route or a single supplier's political leverage, which is exactly what's happening now. I mean, the point about that in Europe, if Europe cuts itself off from Russian oil and gas, it becomes entirely dependent on largely the United States. And the United States has no hesitation about using its control of natural resources to exert power over others. I mean, look what it's doing, with Venezuela. So, oh well, we'll take care of your oil sales, and then we'll decide how you spend your revenues on your country. Look what it's doing in with Cuba. It's basically it's told Mexico not to deliver oil to Cuba. Told everybody basically, that don't deliver oil to Cuba. They've uh, the other day they passed an executive order imposing tariffs on any country delivering oil to Cuba. And then, of course, we were going in for the whole hysteria about Denmark. Denmark, they're taking away Greenland. Please, let's keep Greenland. We want Greenland. So and because the United States was pissed off with the European opposition to its claim on Greenland, the United States threatened tariffs. Eventually, Trump walked them back, but nonetheless, he could easily, return to threatening with the tariffs. So, you talk about this political leverage. There's no political leverage. Russia never used its control of energy supply in order to coerce others. Never, not in the Soviet era, not in the post Soviet era. Never has Russia used its control of oil and gas to exert pressure on the Europeans. The United States, on the other hand, is absolutely does it. It's always done it, and will and will always do it. I mean, this is the same United States that destroyed the Nord Stream pipelines. Either it was the United States, which is the most likely solution, or it was Ukraine working under the auspices of the United States. But that's it. The United States never liked that Nord Stream. They said it over and over again. We don't like you doing this Nord Stream. We don't like you getting your gas from Russia. And they blow it up. And you're talking about leverage, political leverage from Russia. Long before today's political stands, your own countrymen understood that a long-standing Hungarian idea is finally meeting reality. Look at ridiculous nonsense. The Adriatic pipeline is reliable, safe, cost competitive. No, it isn't. And it has the capacity to meet the needs of our friends in Hungary and Slovakia. It helps Europe step away from Russian energy pressure. No, there's no Russian energy pressure. It never has been. Anyway, that is what it was built for. That is what it remains. Croatia is ready to act responsibly and constructively, fully within EU and OFAC regulations to protect supply security, and at a nice little markup for Croatia. The alternative exists. Dependence is no longer fate. Don't let it become your choice. And then this idiot, this cretin, says, P.S. As the Yes Minister TV series puts it, never believe anything until it has been officially denied. Now, why I say he's an idiot and a cretin is that people always bring this one up. The other day, some moron on Twitter said, "Oh, as Bismarck said, never believe anything until it has been officially denied." The person who said this was a British journalist, Claude Cockburn. He's the father of Alexander Cockburn and Andrew Cockburn and Patrick Cockburn. He was the one, he coined this expression, never believe anything until it has been officially denied. So this guy thinks, oh, I'm going to be really clever. I'm going to say it's Yes Minister. Because, well, where else would it have come from? Oh, yeah, it came from Yes Minister. Just like somebody else said, oh, it was Bismarck who said it. It only takes a little bit of research. Do a Google, Chat GPT, say who coined this phrase, never believe anything until it has been officially denied, which is clever and funny. Has nothing to do with any of this discussion. So he just puts it in to show how clever he is, because it had nothing to do with this argument about the Druzhba pipeline and this Croatian oil pipeline. Oh, never believe anything that has been officially done. Oh, look at how clever I am. Somebody says Gaggle search. Yeah, exactly. And anyway, this isn't, but this wasn't really the end of the whole saga. And here we have Seattle who announced today in response. So basically, Ukraine isn't going to do anything. They're basically they're going to use this halt in oil deliveries, basic to apply pressure against Hungary. And Croatia isn't playing ball. So Seattle announced that, okay, fine, we're not going to deliver any more diesel fuel to Ukraine. Now, keep in mind, Ukraine gets its electricity, purchases its electricity from Hungary. So there's always that possibility down the road. I mean, if neither Ukraine nor Croatia is willing to provide this Russian crude to Hungary, then there is always the option of simply cutting Ukraine off from electricity. As it is, the first step is we decided to suspend diesel fuel deliveries to Ukraine. Shipments will not resume until oil transit toward Hungary via the Druzhba pipeline is restored. Zelensky has decided not to restart oil transit for political reasons, deliberately putting Hungary's energy supply at risk. While we play an essential role in Ukraine's energy security, a large part of Ukraine's gas, electricity, and diesel imports arrives through or from Hungary. We cannot be expected to guarantee another country's energy security while our own supply is put at risk. Energy cooperation must be mutual and based on respect, not pressure. And now Euronews, broke a story later today saying Hungary and Slovakia halt diesel exports to Ukraine amid oil transit dispute. So this Slovakia also says no diesel. Hungary and Slovakia said they've suspended diesel exports to Ukraine after Russian oil flows via the Druzhba pipeline were disrupted. Both governments accused Kiev of failing to restore the pipeline, but the European Commission said their energy security is not at risk. And then said, blah, blah. And then it says diesel fuel deliveries to Ukraine have been halted, and diesel fuel deliveries will not resume until Ukrainians resume crude oil deliveries via the Druzhba pipeline. That was Seattle. And then Robert Fico in Slovakia, said, a similar comment. And Fico says Slovnaft is stopping the export of diesel to Ukraine and any other exports, and everything it will process now at home in Slovakia will be intended for the Slovak market. And then Hungary and Slovakia also called on the European Commission to enable the transport of Russian crude oil through Croatian ports towards Hungary and Croatia. Croatia earlier rejected this request, saying the transfer of Russian oil might violate US-American sanctions, which, as I say, it will not violate it because Hungary has been given an exemption. The Commission said on Tuesday that Hungary's and Slovakia's energy security was not at risk, and so on. And then that's what I wanted to, but there's going to be an emergency meeting of the European Commission, I think sometime next week, to discuss this matter. This is all part of the pressure campaign against Hungary, and we'll see if it succeeds. Obviously the Hungarians, they don't particularly like to be bullied, so it could blow up in their faces. One thing that one should remember, through this act on Croatia's part, is that of course Hungary played a quite important role in transferring arms to Croatia in the early 90s during its what they call War of Independence, but of course it was a war of secession from Yugoslavia. So the arms that were going to Croatia were going through from Germany and Austria through Hungary. Hungary in those days was a kind of big supporter of Croatia, big supporter, very much against the Serbs. And this was in the early 90s. But even in 1999, when NATO launched its bombing campaign, this was when during Orban's first go round as Hungary's prime minister, 98. So it was Orban who led Hungary into NATO, and Hungary's reward was they was now part of the NATO campaign against Yugoslavia. Now Orban has made amends since then. He has very good relations with Serbia. He has very good relations with the Republika Srpska. He wouldn't join in now with any kind of a bombing campaign against the Serbs. And so you'd have to then think back to those days of the early 90s, more than 30 years ago, when Hungary was facilitating the arming of Croatia and thereby the the mass expulsion of Serbs from Croatia. That was all, facilitated by Germany, of course, and but nonetheless, Hungary unfortunately played a role in all of that. So that was probably a bad move. Anyway, let's now address the comments of Gagglers. These are the people who do what they can. Every week, several times a week, they do what they can in order to ensure that the dogs are in a good frame of mind, that they're fed, kept reasonably happy. So I really appreciate the generosity of the Gagglers. And so first off, Danuki, who always makes great contributions to our locals board. So Danuki says, "Dear George, by what factor do you reckon they are overhyping the pie in the sky BS $12 trillion deal, just like they did with the BS Ukraine rare earths? And how desperate is the Kremlin oligarchy to return to the good graces of the West? And do you think conniving weasel Dmitriev is positioning himself as heir apparent to Vladimir Vladimirovich?" Well, it's a very interesting question. Dmitriev, I think, has been assigned the role of the go-to person to deal with Witkoff and Jared Kushner. So all three of them are fundamentally businessmen. They're in the business of making money. So he's been put in charge of the economic and financial negotiations on behalf of Russia. So Dmitriev is involved pretty much everywhere. Now, I know there are people who think that this is just for show and that this is all done, in order that Putin just wants to keep Trump happy. He wants to present somebody who talks the language of Trump, who talks the language of Witkoff, and that's the role of Dmitriev. I think that there's more to it than that. And unfortunately, I think that the sanctions policy is hitting Russia, and it's going to keep hitting Russia. I think it is going to hurt Russia. I think Putin knows that it is going to hurt Russia. I mean, the idea that Russia can just simply march on without worrying about sanctions, I think is absurd. So I think Putin has figured out that even if, best case scenario, Russia wins the war in the Donbass, clears out the Donbass, pushes out all Ukrainian forces. We're some way away from that, but let's say it's done. And then let's say Russia also cleans out Kherson and Zaporozhye of Ukrainian forces. Also, we're some way away from that, but let's say that happens. Russia still has a problem, which is the entirety of the West is mobilized against Russia. And that means that the sanctions policy will remain in place, and particularly so if Russia is seen to have won the war in Ukraine. I mean, that's questionable whether winning or whatever, but let's say that, I'm going by the Xenon John Mearsheimer argument. Oh, Russia will have won the war. Russia wins the war. Okay, what happens when Russia wins the war? Well, the sanctions remain in place, which means it's going to be quite difficult to base any kind of economic recovery as long as the West is inflicting the sanctions. And even the thing, oh, we can ignore the West, we've got India and China, but that is also a not a not sustainable policy, because eventually, and it's already happening, India is going to start cutting back on its oil imports from Russia. I mean, it's coming under pressure from the United States. India needs the United States as a trading partner, and it's made a promise to Trump, and whether whether you can believe the promise or not, they nonetheless are cutting back on the imports of Russian crude, and they are paying at a substantial discount. So this is much lower prices than what Russia was getting for its oil when it was selling oil to the Europeans. So they're selling now at a discount to India. So they're getting much less, earning much less revenue through sales to India. And if India then continues to cut back and continues to insist on paying even less for Russian crude, then that is going to cause economic problems for Russia. And China, ultimately, it's just there's the overcapacity. At least these refineries already are basically handling as much Russian crude as China is able to. So that it's questionable whether China can go on importing from Russia. But it's possible they can do. I mean, if Iran is brought to its knees by the United States, Venezuela is not going to be exporting oil to China. Iran is not going to be exporting oil to China. So, it's possible that China will just have to completely adapt itself to Russian crude. Okay, but that's still a problem. It's still Russia will not be earning anything like what it was earning when it was exporting oil to Europe. So, going back to trying to answer Danuki's question, I think I think Putin wants to work out some kind of a deal whereby the sanctions are lifted and whereby some kind of uh, trade, economic, financial agreement is reached with the United States, and I think that's the purpose of the Dmitriev's role. And I think since this subject has come up, it's worth I think taking a look at this was the story that was in Bloomberg. It appeared a few days ago, and we can take it with a pinch of salt, though the Russians haven't denied the story. So it says Russian memo sees return to dollar system in pitch made for Trump. So this is a document reviewed by Bloomberg. It looks on the face of it that Dmitriev is the author of this document. And here it says the high level memo, which was drafted this year, details 7 points where, in the Kremlin's view, Russian and US economic interests could converge following a deal to end the war in Ukraine. It sees the two countries working together to champion fossil fuels over greener alternatives, as well as joint investments in natural gas, offshore oil, and critical raw materials, plus windfalls for US companies. So this is basically the plan as set out is, we're going to open up our economy for US investment, not European investment, US investment. So the Russians they've kind of given up on the Europeans. They don't think that the Europeans will ever lift sanctions, or the Europeans are not going to get involved in any long-term investments. But they have hopes for the United States. And then here, the proposal, which was circulated among senior Russian officials, provides previously unreported insight into Kremlin thinking, and so on. At the heart of the offer is Russia's return to the dollar settlement system, a move which would mean a stunning reversal of Kremlin policy and potentially a dramatic shakeup for global finance. So the US has already proposed gradually lifting sanctions on Russia as part of any peace agreement, a necessary first step for the country to start transacting in dollars again. But what the Kremlin memo considers would go further. Until now, finding alternatives to the dollar rather than restoring links to the US-led system has been a key goal for Russia, as President Putin sought to deepen his relationship with China. For that reason, Western governments officials familiar with the contents of the document said they think it's extremely unlikely that Putin would ultimately pursue a deal that runs counter to Beijing's interests. That's that's a reasonable argument. On the other hand, I I think the economic strangulation of Russia is having an effect, and I think therefore it makes some sense for for Russia at least to attempt to work something out with the United States. As long as Trump is there, they have somebody who, in principle, is open to restoring some kind of economic and trading relations with Russia and the lifting of sanctions. That was part of the original 28-point plan. And then, so here's the 7 points. Let's just go quickly over the 7 points. Areas where Kremlin memo sees U.S. and Russian economic interests converge. Long-term aviation contracts. This is number one, to modernize Russia's fleet of aircraft plus potential U.S. participation in Russian manufacturing. Joint oil and LNG ventures. So this is joint Russian and U.S. oil and LNG ventures, including offshore and hard-to-recover reserves, which take into account previous U.S. investments and would allow American firms to recover past losses. This is very important because and you can see how Dmitriev is thinking. He's, very much echoing Trump's, line of thought. Hey, your people lost a lot of money here. We will make good on that, because this is the point Trump now, he's made this point against Venezuela. All these American investors, all the American oil companies lost so much money because of Chavez and Maduro. They have to be made whole. They have to be compensated. Trump is saying the same thing about Cuba. So this is how the Russians are now pitching it, by saying joint oil and LNG ventures, including offshore and hard-to-recover reserves, which take into account previous U.S. investments and would allow American firms to recover past losses. So that's the pitch to Trump, would allow American firms to recover past losses. Preferential conditions for U.S. companies to return to the Russian consumer market. See, preferential conditions. So U.S. companies will get preferential conditions. Nothing for anyone else. The Europeans get nothing. Cooperation on nuclear energy, including AI ventures. Russia's return to the dollar settlement system. Again, very much a pitch to Trump. Remember how Trump has threatened BRICS over that any attempt to challenge the supremacy of the dollar as the reserve currency, said, Russia's return to the dollar settlement system. And of course, because the renminbi, it can't possibly replace the dollar. Everybody knows this. It's nonsensical that he would ever be able to replace the dollar. China just doesn't have the economic and financial system to sustain a reserve currency. It's ludicrous. All these. multipolarities creatures who've been talking about how China will supply the world's reserve currency. It's not going to happen. So Russia's return to the dollar settlement system, including possibly for Russian energy transactions, cooperation on raw materials such as lithium, copper, nickel, and platinum, working together to push fossil fuels as an alternative to climate friendly ideology. Again, notice how this appealed to Trump. Fossil fuels. The hell with all this renewables, climate friendly, that Green New Deal. That's all crap. None of it's going to produce anything. There's no sun, there's no wind. It's not going to produce anything. And so therefore, yeah, we're on the same page. We want energy to be based on fossil fuels, and so climate friendly ideology and low emission solutions that favor China and Europe. Okay, so that's the the uh, the argument, and oh, oh, yes, I realize now that the people weren't actually able to see the slides as I was speaking. Let me see. I thought that I had that. Um, so all right. Let me just go back and just to go over the 7 points again, so people can actually see the 7 points in that Bloomberg article. Um, so here we have. So yeah, this was here are just the 7 points. I have to go over it because I was under the impression that I had the thing. So anyway, here areas where the Kremlin memo sees U.S. and Russian economic interests converge. One, long-term aviation contracts to modernize Russia's fleet of aircraft plus potential U.S. participation in Russian manufacturing. One, two, joint oil and LNG ventures, including offshore and hard-to-recover reserves, which take into account previous U.S. investments and would allow American firms to recover past losses. That's the key. That's I said it before. That's the key. Very much on Trump's wavelength, would allow American firms to recover past losses. Preferential conditions for U.S. Companies, conditions for U.S. companies to return to the Russian consumer market. And then cooperation on nuclear energy, including for AI ventures. Russia's return to the dollar settlement system. That's absolutely geared towards Trump, including possibly for Russian energy transactions. In other words, Russian energy, Russia will be able to earn money on its oil and gas sales using the dollar. Cooperation on raw materials such as lithium, copper, and nickel and platinum, working together to push fossil fuels as an alternative to climate friendly ideology and low emission solutions that favor China and Europe. So that's all part of this Russian plan to appeal to Trump. So that's say, hey, well, this is we're going to do all of these things. Fossil fuels, the dollar-denominated system, and we'll make good on American investment. So any American money that you've lost in the past. Now, that's the plan as outlined by Dmitriev that Bloomberg published. That doesn't mean that this has any real chance. So somebody said, we didn't get these slides earlier. No, that you didn't. I'm sorry that you didn't. But yeah, I'm sorry about that. But anyway, that was this plan, and I do think Dmitriev is clearly speaking for Putin. I mean, he's involved in all of these negotiations, so he's obviously Putin has entrusted this plan to appeal to Trump of some kind of economic and financial partnership between the United States and Russia. I have my doubts that it's going to work. And I just doubt that Trump will have the courage or the determination to break with his European allies and essentially, work something out with Russia. I think he hasn't shown it. He said things like that, said that he might be open to some kind of a deal along those lines. I just don't think that that's likely to happen. But I think that that is very much along the lines of what Dmitriev is thinking. And as I say, I think that for Russia, I mean, they are very seriously thinking about, this sanctions regime will have serious long term consequences for Russia. So even if you win this war, whatever that is, you win this war against Ukraine, Ukraine is collapses, and one you still have this sanctions regime imposed on you in perpetuity. Anyway, that was um, the Dmitriev's plan. So anyway, thank you. Um, uh, Thank you, Danaki. Dale Owens, good to see you. And then Dale asked, George, the other day you were saying that maybe Harold Wilson refused to intervene militarily against Rhodesian UDI in 65 because the army would not back such a move. Do you think he ultimately resigned in 76 because he feared a military coup? That's always been a very interesting um, issue, why he suddenly resigned in 76. Now, on the face of it, he was long past his best. His heyday was really when he was in office in 64 to 70. He used to be he was very cocky, clever, funny. But he lost the 1970 election. Very much that came as a shock to him because all the polls were predicting that Labour would win. He wasn't expecting to lose, and he certainly felt very stung by losing to Edward Heath, whom he despised. He thought Heath was a clodhopper, which he was. So that kind of broke Wilson. Wilson was never really recovered from that defeat. And then in 74, when Heath idiotically called a general election in February 74 over the miners' strike, Wilson, now because he had already lost his touch, Wilson thought that Heath would win. But much to Wilson's surprise, he got it wrong again, and Heath lost that election. And it was a hung parliament, but Wilson's Labour Party had the largest number of seats, and so Wilson returned to office in February 74. He wasn't expecting it, and he wasn't much looking forward to it. And so, and then in October 74, there was another election, and then Wilson won that election. He gained a small majority in Parliament, but Wilson really just his heart wasn't in it anymore. He'd now been leader of the party for 11 years, and it was just he was clearly tired. Now he during from 74 to 76 he was really having real problems, first of all with the left of his party. This was really the height of the power of the left within the Labour Party. Obviously having problem with all the economic problems Britain was facing following the oil shock and everything else. And so he was having the sureness of touch that he once had in dealing with the left of the party had deserted him. He wasn't really doing it very well. But then he had these problems nearer home with within MI5, who suspected him of being a Soviet agent. And this was a long-standing rumor that somehow he was he had been a Soviet agent. A lot of that um, stemmed from the strange death of his predecessor Hugh Gateskill. Gateskill had actually visited the Soviet embassy, and then soon after that, Gateskill died of a mysterious illness, and then Wilson became prime minister. Gateskill was, of course, kind of on the right of the party, and so on. So that a lot of it was stemmed, but you had this Peter Wright, and those people in MI5 were absolutely convinced that Wilson was a Soviet agent, as did people within the CIA, including James Angleton. They all thought Wilson was a Soviet agent, and some of the people who worked for Wilson had some links to the Soviet Union. They weren't Soviet agents, but it all fueled this. And I think Wilson just simply got very I think he was exhausted from fighting MI5. Very difficult for a prime minister to deal with MI5. These are people, these are career civil servants. Very, very hard to get rid of career civil servants. So this is MI5 is there plotting against you. So I don't know whether he was thinking in terms of a military coup. I think it was a combination of factors this constant fight with MI5, the constant fight with the left. I know there was a lot of talk during his first term in office about some sort of a coup in Britain with Lord Mountbatten becoming a leader, but it always struck me as being ridiculous. I don't know how you can have a coup in Britain. I don't know how the mechanics of taking over the country by the military would be. But I don't think it's wholly. It's not beyond the bounds of possibility that there was a fear within the government that as Britain becomes ever more ungovernable, the unions are just simply out of control. And it seems like the country is on the brink of complete disintegration. I mean, those were the thoughts that were going on at that time. If anyone who was around during the early to mid 1970s, there were real fears either of essentially a kind of a communist government taking over in Britain, communist through the trade unions. I mean, obviously not the Communist Party, because the Communist Party had about 0.1% of the vote. So the Communist Party couldn't take anything over. But through their control of the trade union movement, some of the key trade union leaders were communists. Through there, the communists could take over in Britain. So I think that was one of the scenarios that were absolutely being discussed at that time of a communist takeover of Britain. Alternatively, there was, as Dale points out, there was the view that if the military had convinced themselves that the communists were likely to take over, then the military would actually step in and become, just a coup. There would be a military coup to prevent a communist takeover of Britain. That was seriously believed. I don't know whether Wilson himself believed this was likely, but at the time, there was definitely, as I say, in the early mid 1970s, a fear that there would be either a communist takeover of Britain, or the military would just step in to prevent the communists. So in other words, it'll be something along the lines of the Greek colonels, what happened in Greece, and then of course there was the case of Portugal, where also in 1974 there was. The government there was overthrown. It wasn't a democratic government. The government was overthrown, and there was a fear following that the communists would take over. So I think all that was around at the time. Wilson, I think, was just exhausted. So I don't know whether he thought that the military would take over, but he was just, I think he was completely drained of any all energy and any desire to continue as prime minister. Um, and then anyway, so that thank you, Dale. And then Dale asked, to what extent do you think the Suez Crisis impacted the UK psyche? That's a very good question. Um, I think it did, and I think the conclusion that Britain's elite drew from the Suez Crisis is that Britain's days as an imperial power were over, absolutely over. There was no future at all to thinking that Britain could in any way be an international player. That would still count in the world, and that if Britain wanted to remain a major power in the world, it always had to stick to the Americans. Never, never, never fall out with the Americans. And I think that they realized that was Anthony Eden's biggest mistake, that he thought that the Americans would respect Britain. They had enough respect for Britain that they would accept Britain having a prerogative over Egypt. After all, Britain had been the imperial power in Egypt, and that the United States would just step aside and allow Britain to essentially topple the government of Nasser. The Americans weren't prepared to do that. They absolutely refused to accept Britain as in any way an imperial power, or that they had any kind of um, rights in Egypt that the United States didn't have. And so, when the Suez Crisis hit, and the Americans really applied the pressure against the British with a run on the pound, that would led to the collapse of Anthony Eden, his resignation, and from then on, everything that Britain did was to liquidate all of its imperial assets, what remained east of Suez and everything else. Boom, the decolonization took place really within the next few years, and that was one thing. And then the second thing was, of course, to keep in with the Americans at all times, never, never fall out with the Americans. So I think it had quite an impact on how the British saw themselves. It was really the end of imperial glory. Anyway, thank you, Dale. And then Summer Petro says, I always understood Harold Wilson's surprise resignation was triggered by the realization he was suffering from the early onset of forgetfulness. He did go on to have dementia in later years. Yeah, he did, but he also did things during those later years. He wrote books. He did a lot of interviews. I mean, he went on for quite a long time. I think he died, in 1991. So he resigns in 76, and he lived on for another 15 years. And if you see his interviews in those later years, he still had his own sharpness and wit. So yeah, I think maybe he had dementia. He did drink a lot during those last 2 years as a prime minister. He began, do some serious drinking. I think the stress of everything of those years was really taking its toll. But I think I think he led a reasonably productive life after his resignation. And then Dale, in response to Samba Petros's point, I always heard that as well, but sometimes I hear another theory about a coup plots by the military and Rees-Mogg, etc. So, yeah, as I say, a lot of people at the time thought that there was a likelihood or a possibility of a coup, just as people thought that there was a possibility of a communist takeover. Communism in the mid 1970s was not such an unrealistic plan as it now seems. I mean, you had the very powerful Italian Communist Party, it was the biggest party next to the Christian Democrats. And then you had, of course, the very powerful French Communist Party. And then you had Franco's government had fallen, and so you had quite a powerful Spanish Communist Party. So, it seemed like Britain was really part of this that European movement towards some kind of communism, cum neutrality. And then, but then the question, of course, always arose: well, would the British military allow the communists to take over in Britain via the trade union movement? And nobody really knew that. I mean, and now we say, oh, the military completely subordinated to civilian leadership. Maybe, or maybe not. I mean, that we nobody ever really knew. I mean, the people who were in the military in those days tended to be very conservative, very, very anti-communist, just like they are very anti-Russian today. But fundamentally, they were very conservative. They hated the Labour Party, they hated the Labour government, and so therefore, it wasn't unrealistic to think that if push comes to shove, this very conservative military would take over and avert a communist seizure of power. Anyway, thank you, Dale and Summer Petros. Cynthia, always very good to see Cynthia. So one of our outstanding contributors, our film expert and scholar and encyclopedic knowledge practitioner of cinema, who always contributes so many fascinating and intriguing details about filmmaking and film production and film history. And so we're always very fortunate to enjoy Cynthia's very learned and informative contributions, particularly when we have our Monday screenings. And so on Monday, we had the classic La Règle du Jeu, one of the great films, with Jean Renoir, and Cynthia just always outdid herself with providing so many really fascinating observations and critical judgment. And so watch the film, read Cynthia's comments, and then next week we have yet another poll for the screening, which is cults, secret societies, and I think meetings of the rich and powerful. So that was inspired by the Jeffrey Epstein thing. Just how to what extent cinema has explored the existence of secret societies and groups, sinister groupings of the rich and powerful. So there's 8 films to choose from. They're all good films. So they're all made by great filmmakers. The films by Pasolini, by Buñuel, Polanski. These all classic movies, and then and Visconti as well. So please, if you haven't already, vote, decide what we should see next week. At the moment, Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut has taken a decisive lead, but there's plenty of time to vote. And so if you don't like Eyes Wide Shut, vote for something else. So anyway, to return to Cynthia's question. So Cynthia says, as I understand it, Prince Andrew committed the same offense I believe Peter Mandelson did. Yeah, no, that's exactly my understanding. Namely, passing privileged government information to Jeffrey Epstein. Yeah, privilege. Yeah, but nothing classified. Who allegedly used such access as part of a blackmail network. I don't know. I don't know whether he did use it as a blackmail network. I think he probably, if he used it at all, he used it maybe to make some money, though I don't know how much money he could make as a result of it. But what's important, of course, is that this was the social network. He created networks of powerful and influential people. Well, how do you do it? You do it by being an insider. You have to persuade people that you are privy to inside information. You know what's going on. You know about what deals are being made. You know where to invest money, where to take your money out, and that was the key to his success. I mean, why would people want to be around him? Well, obviously, one reason is he was actually very good at his job. He knew something about financial planning. But the other thing is, he had so many friends. Now, somebody who has so many friends, so many influential friends who hang around with him, then naturally other influential people want to be in with Epstein because they want to know what's going on, something that things they haven't heard about. So I don't think there's any blackmail. I just haven't seen any evidence that he engaged in any blackmail. If you engage in blackmail, you very quickly lose your friends. I mean, it just is not conducive to friendship if people think that you're going to blackmail them or you're going to try and extort money from them. So I think it was, yeah, he needed to have show that he had access, and that people wanted to be with Epstein. Well, hey, he's the one in the know. He knows what's going on. I guess part of a blackmail network. If Mandelson is not investigated or charged for the same conduct, isn't it reasonable to question whether Prince Andrew is being singled out as a scapegoat? Well, I think he is being singled out as a scapegoat. I think there's a real pile-on in his case because he was a royal, he was a prince, he had really everything bestowed upon him from the earliest age, and there is a sadistic quality and humanity that they relish and delight in the high and mighty being brought down. And I think that's the reason why it's it's Prince Andrew who has been singled out by the police, and who the police were very, very insulting in the way they described it. A man in Norfolk, a man in Norfolk is helping with our inquiries. Yeah, and everyone's rubbing their hands with glee. I mean, it's just I watched a little bit of CNN today, and the delight on the part of everybody who comes on that he has been brought down, and not one ever says brought down for what. This whole thing started with this nonsensical claim by Virginia Giuffre that she had sexual relations with him, and but even she never claimed that that he had raped her or anything else. But that somehow brought, because she was making these claims about Epstein, so that kind of brought him into the whole story. And he had been friends with Epstein, but lots of people had been friends with Epstein. But because they couldn't get Prince Andrew on the sexual thing, they couldn't find that he did anything sexually inappropriate. They came up with this. To me, a absolutely cockamamie charge that misconduct in public office. I have no idea what that means. Same with Mandelson. Mandelson's openly gay, so how could he be involved in the trafficking of underage girls, which the charge is being made against Epstein, even though no evidence has been made that he was engaged in trafficking underage girls. But since they couldn't get Mandelson on that, they also had this thing. Oh, we had this information. So it's all really about the hysteria over Epstein. Somebody has to pay. Somebody has to be punished, and so therefore, well, we'll hit Andrew on this, and we'll hit Mandelson on that. I mean, it is a little like Russiagate. If you recall, with Russiagate, the hysteria over the Trump Putin connection, Russian interference in the 2016 election. So somebody had to be punished, and so they punished some people who had absolutely nothing to do with Russia. I mean, you remember there was the case of Paul Manafort. They went after Paul Manafort for some tax nonsense. And then there was the Maria Butina. Maria Butina was actually Russian, but she had nothing to do with Russiagate. But they had to go after her just to show, oh, look, we're going after Russians. We're taking Russiagate seriously. So I think something like that is going on here. But I think there's the sadistic, unfortunately, the sadistic, gleeful attitude of humanity. They just enjoy, delight in the high and mighty and the rich being brought to heel, and now's the time to kick him. Now that he's in the gutter, you take a big, nice boot to him. Anyway, the Cynthia goes on. No one knows how Trump might move against Iran. Yeah, but he may try removing key leaders to trigger regime change. Yeah, I think that would certainly be. Yeah, I think that's a likely option. I think they would try to go for assassinations. I mean, that's the Israel plan, and I think they would do it. They would kill key um, Iranian regime leaders. I don't think that would bring about regime change, but yeah, I think that's likely. That idea rests on claims the government is heavily infiltrated with pro-Zionist traitors, supplying the U.S. and Israel with precise intelligence on officials' locations, enabling decapitation strikes. I agree. I think it has been thoroughly infiltrated, and they may well have all kinds of ways of hitting key Iranian leaders. They probably know, I don't think it would be that difficult to hit Khamenei um, and other key leaders. As I say, I don't think that necessarily that will deliver a regime change. I mean, it might create chaos, and maybe that, and I think that's obviously the Israeli plan: just create chaos, civil war, whatever irredentist nationalist movements, just as much as create as much of a mess as possible. I mean, that's a, I think that's quite possible. Anyway, enabling together. Yeah. Given persistent allegations of disloyal insiders aligned with rival powers, it wouldn't be surprising if Trump is cooking up some trickery rather than planning a prolonged assault. I agree, and I think that's quite possible that they are thinking of these decapitation strikes hitting key Iranian leaders, hitting IRGC command centers, and hoping either that this would lead to a collapse in the government or that it might trigger some kind of an uprising and the government would just be too would be at sixes and sevens, unable really to deal uh, with an insurrection. That may be the calculation. I think it's a high risk strategy. I'm not sure that's a plan like that is likely to work. But as I said, it's sort of what they did in the case of Libya. Um, it succeeded to a certain extent. I mean, yes, it succeeded in destroying Gaddafi, but it didn't in any way restore the kind of the state of Libya. And I think that's probably the goal here. Hey, let's just instigate decades of wars in Iran. So Iran will just be in a total mess for years to come. That's the Israeli plan, and Trump may well be working towards that. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. Marty, what was it? Marty. So Marty has a picture. Always good to see you, Marty. Thank you so much. And Marty has a picture of the Board of Peace meeting, and is bringing down the gavel. And there you can see, I can see Jared Kushner on the left, and then you can see Aliyev on the right, and there's the gaggle, the board of not the gaggle, the gavel of Trump at the Board of Peace. Yes, as I was saying earlier, that it's not exactly not very much peace today. I mean, Trump's message was definitely not one of peace. I mean, essentially, he's threatening war. But Marty, always good to see you. Thank you so much. Thank you for all of your very humorous and entertaining postings. Really, I really enjoyed them. So I'm sure Gagglers do. So thank you. Anne Marie, very good to see you again. We always miss you when you're not here. And Anne Marie, as I always say, is a musical practitioner and expert par excellence. Somebody who's always helping us understand about music, helping us understand the playing of music, and everything that's involved in playing concert music at the highest level, and because she herself has played music at the highest level with finest orchestras in the world, finest conductors and performers and composers. It's just an amazing record. And as I would love it if Anne Marie were able to post some clips of her playing. That would, I think, we would all really enjoy. She's done it some in the past, but that would be a real delight for all of us. So we're very fortunate to have Anne Marie here. We're very fortunate to enjoy her extraordinary contributions, and so thank you so much, and thank you, Anne Marie, for your generosity. And then we have Robert. Good to see you, Robert. And Robert says that. Uh, just before I go to Robert, I see Summer Petros says, George, glad you made mention that Hungary supported Croatia going out on a limb, supplying some arms in the early 1990s. I remember it also. Yeah, it's kind of been forgotten that Hungary played a very bad role. It's very because it essentially contributed to the war in Yugoslavia, which was a terrible war. And Hungary, thanks to Germany and Austria, who have a long-standing animus towards the Serb and a long-standing destabilizing influence on the Balkans, they use Hungary essentially to fuel Croatia's secession and thereby to fuel the wars in Yugoslavia. And so Hungary, unfortunately, was caught up in that, as always happens. And I think, as Orban himself points out, Hungary is always getting caught up in other countries' wars, and Hungary then pays the price. So that was another unfortunate episode, that Hungary played a very, very unfortunate role in the wars in Yugoslavia. And now the ungrateful Croats, don't want to help Hungary. Anyway, Robert says the latest in NYC is Mamdani failing to get Albany to raise income taxes, is now pushing a property tax hike. Yeah, I saw that. He's now, yeah, that's kind of not exactly a surprise that he's going for a property tax hike. This will unfold along two paths. Rent stabilized buildings, unable to raise rents freely, would absorb higher taxes and face financial strain. Market rate landlords could try to pass costs on through rent increases. One path squeezes building finances, the other higher rents, both a long way away from the affordable housing platform. Yes, that he was promising. No, I think that's a very good point. Of course, with the rent stabilization, I mean, there's fewer and fewer apartments that are still in rent stabilized buildings, because as long as you can keep raising the rents, at some point they reach that limit when they're now already outside rent stabilization. I think it's 2,500. I think all rents below 2,500 are rent stabilized, but anything above 2,500, then it's outside rent stabilization, and therefore landlords can just raise the rents however much they want. I think that's right. I think that's exactly the way it's going to go. That when it comes to the rent board, I think he's obviously going to try and make sure that the rent board isn't able to raise rents. In other words, basically rents will remain the same, which would mean, obviously, then they're going to have to absorb the higher costs. The landlords in those buildings will absorb the high cost, but the market rate landlords, as you say, they're going to pass on the high costs because they can, through rent increases. So therefore, that's what. Now, keep in mind, Mamdani did promise. I mean, yeah, he talked about affordability and all that. The buzzword of the moment. So he talked about this affordability, but he did say that he was going to tax white people. I mean, he said that white people. Now, of course, he kind of walked that back, and when he, as he got closer to the election. But he did say that's going to be his policy. He's going to raise taxes on white people. Well, by white people, he meant people who were richer, and therefore the people who had owned property. So that's who he identified. So it was always feasible that he was going to raise taxes and taxes on property because well, property owners are by and large white, and so that I think it was always likely. But of course, the people who believed that he was actually going to deliver affordable housing, I mean, they just simply didn't understand economics. I mean, that's a it goes with the territory that when you get these kind of I don't know, kind of leftish populist leaders, that people don't really pay too much attention to economics, and they say, "Oh, that's great, it's going to be affordable." Just it's going to be affordable, and yeah, it's not going to it's not going to happen. So it's kind of was always on the cards that this is where Mamdani's policies would lead. Anyway, thank you so much, Robert. Really appreciate your generosity, and I think it's time to end this. Thank you, everybody who joined me. Thank you. It was a cold, wet day. I'm sure, but people are all over the world. Not necessarily exposed to the cold and wet. We're going to do some more podcasts over the weekend, and then on next Monday we'll have the live stream with Peter, and then next Tuesday it's once again my solo live stream. The dogs, they're not going to be in a good mood. I mean, it's getting harder and harder to exchange ideas with them. They just don't want to debate anything. They just, all they can talk about is money, money, money. What's happening to the tip jar? That's all they can say. Anyway, that's my problem. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for all of your questions. Thank you for your generosity, and look forward to seeing you very soon. All the best. Good night. Bye-bye.